Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is One Piece East Blue Saga Logtown Arc, episode 47, Sendai Katetsu and Yubashiri, Zoro's New Swords, and the Female Sergeant Major. Episode in a nutshell is a brief reminder of what happens in the episode. So the episode begins with Luffy at the execution stand where he was left off at the last episode's ending, and he decides to start climbing it, and this is when he's about halfway up when Smoker decides to show up, and Smoker then basically scolds him for being on the thing, challenges him, and says he's under arrest. Luffy then makes a fool of himself by continually trying to hit Smoker, failing, getting hit himself, and then when he tries to do a large attack, ends up sending himself flying way across the city to the other side, where he then has to start his search for the execution platform all over again. Meanwhile, Buggy is there with his crew and Alvida looking for Luffy, and he does some tarot readings where he confirms that Luffy should be in town, and then when Alvida asks him if he's going to manage to kill Luffy, when he flips the card, it's the Joker with his face on it, and she says, "Oh, so you're the one who's gonna die." And Buggy freaks out about this. Then Buggy goes out when Moji and Richie see Luffy flying through the sky. He goes out to try to find him, and then at one point, he and Luffy do cross paths, but just the way that they're looking, they keep missing seeing each other. And then Buggy asks if he sees him. Luffy asks where the execution platform is. Buggy tells him the way. Luffy runs off, and only then does Buggy realize that Luffy had been literally right there, and he just didn't see him before he then again tries to run after him. But the vast majority of the episode, apart from that adorable little Buggy section, was about Zoro and his new sword. So in the last episode, he met Tashigi, who then decides that he looks poor, so she needs to give him a job and forgive him for breaking her glasses, and so she takes him to the Marine headquarters to give him a job as a cleaning boy so he wouldn't have to worry about money ever again. And he, for whatever reason, maybe because she looks like Hyuna, decides to actually stay there and help out with the cleaning briefly, until a couple of Marines actually recognize that he is the bounty hunter Rono Azora, who is now part of Luffy's crew, and attack him. He defends himself and leaves, and ends up at the sword store where he basically tells the owner he has 100,000, he needs 2 swords, and he's directed to some bins where there are cheap swords. However, before he can start looking, the owner sees the Wado Ichimonji, whose current sword, tries to buy it for him at a very reduced price, but Tashigi arrives and basically she's a sword enthusiast, and she tells him about that sword and how it's worth like 10 million berry if he was to want to sell it, and that's like the minimum amount, which upsets the store owner. But then Zoro does go to the bins after the sword store owner realizes he's not going to be able to buy the Wado Ichimonji, and then Zoro goes through the bin, finds his Sendai Katetsu, which is a cursed sword, but one of the graded swords, which is something that exists in the world. There are some famous swords that are graded as being like top quality above regular swords, and while the cursed sword isn't like the top, it is within those graded swords and therefore extremely well priced. And the owner then says, like, he put it in that bin, but he can't sell it because it's cursed, so Zoro decides to test his luck against the curse, and he throws the sword up, holds his arm out, And when the sword comes down and it ends up being the back of the blade that touches his arm before it goes into the ground, he decides he's going to buy the sword. Um, and the owner then basically tells him, "Nope, I'm not going to take money for it. In fact, you've impressed me so much with your guts and your luck that I'm going to give you this other sword, Yubashiri, which is basically the sword owner's family treasure, and also a graded sword, though not as highly graded as the Sendai Katetsu, um, for free. So Zoro gets to leave with his swords for free, and now is back to having 3 swords, and all 3 of them are legendary. And that is where we end this episode. So now that we've been reminded about what happened in the episode, we'll now rank the episode. As always, ranking first on the mostly objective ranking list, which uses set values, and while emotion is out of play, bias and judgment can apply. And then the personal ranking list, which is based on opinion and entertainment value. And so on our mostly objective rank values, we start with our multi-arc supporting character development, and this is where we learn a bit more about Tashigi as a character. We learn that she's a sergeant major, a sword enthusiast, and her personal weapon is the Meito Shigure, which is her sword that was being polished in the last episode, which is why she shows up to the sword shop when Zoro is there. We also learn that she's extremely clumsy and a bit of a ditz. Like a little ditzy, like empty-headed, unfocused. You know the character arc, um, or character trope. Trope I was looking for. And that's worth 3 points. Then we have 4 points for our multi-arc main character growth, and this of course has to do with Zoro obtaining his new swords, which will allow him to use his sword style going forward, as his previous swords are broken, and that again is the Sendai Katetsu and the Yubashiri, both of which he obtained for free from the sword owner, sword store owner, and that's 4 points, bringing us to 7. Then we have 2 pieces of world building. The first one is that we get an actual timeline for Gold Roger's execution. We obviously know it happened. It's been in the prologue and the flashbacks from the episodes, but we in this episode are told specifically that by Smoker, who tells Luffy that he witnessed the execution 22 years ago. So we now know it was exactly 22 years previously that Goldie Roger was executed on the execution platform. And then we also learned that graded swords exist. And that is also worth another 4 points, bringing us to 15 points. But we do have a couple of negatives for the episode. The first, of course, is minus 4 points for the fact that it is having no main plot significance. Like, it is a filler episode. I mean, in theory, you could say Zoro getting swords because he'll use them in the future could be, plot focused, but ultimately, like, it's basically Luffy making a fool of himself and then some comedy with Buggy and then Zoro shopping. So, as far as like an overarching main plot and it being a significant episode, I don't think it is. If anything, it has extremely minor significance, but I just didn't feel like it had enough significance to be considered a um anything other than like kind of like a filler episode, and so I did take the 4 points for it. And then also minus 2 points for climbing on a monument because the execution platform is kept there as a monument and an attraction for people to come to Log Town and see. And so, just like in reality, it's highly disrespectful to, climb on monuments, vandalize monuments, destroy monuments, do any sort of negative behavior towards monuments because monuments are built because something very important happened that is important to the community that that monument belongs to. And so you should never, in my opinion, do anything to a monument unless the monument literally says that you can do that. Assume you can't and just don't. So Luffy climbing on the monument was pretty disrespectful. and could potentially have damaged it, although in this case it is a pretty firm structure, so I don't think he was going to damage it. But again, disrespectful, and I took 2 points for that because I do think it is negative messaging to have a character just randomly decide to play around on a monument. But that brings us to a total of 9 points out of 10 for this episode. And that does put it into second place. So our mostly objective ranking, we had the first episode, the town of the beginning and the end, arrival at Logtown. And then in this episode, we had Sandai Katetsu and Yubashiri, Zoro's new swords, and the female sergeant major. Now for my personal ranking, I enjoyed the episode. I thought there was a lot of comedy. It had Buggy in it, and as we all know, I am very biased towards Buggy. I think he's like he's my favorite character, bar none. Like he's not a main character, but like if he is on screen, he's overshadowing everybody else, in my opinion. So obviously I love to see it. So I enjoyed the little Buggy snippets that we got. There was again the comedy of it all. And then Zoro getting kind of strong-armed by himself because of how Toshigi looks like Kuina into temporarily working at the Marine headquarters. Um, and like as soon as she leaves him, like you'd think he'd just leave, but instead he actually starts doing the work, and even Nami, as she's passing, sees him taking out the trash and is like, I'm just gonna pretend I did not see anything, because she has like no idea what he's doing there or why he's there, and only when he's caught by other Marines who actually recognize him does he actually leave, which I thought was hilarious and a highlight of the episode. But then the rest of the episode is basically him shopping, and then Toshigi fangirling over swords, and it's like he is a swordsman, that makes sense, but also that part of the episode was a little bit boring, and like I said, it didn't have real strong plot value. And so for the entertainment value, I gave it an 8 out of 10, but I couldn't give it higher than that just simply because I didn't feel like it had a lot of significance, and there were some parts where it was a little bit boring. So with that, 8 out of 10, it actually puts it in first place on my personal ranking. Sandai Katetsu and Yabashiri, Zoro's new swords, and the female sergeant major. And then in second was the first episode of the arc, the town of the beginning and the end, arrival at Logtown. Which now brings us to the saga ranking so far. And this, of course, is where we are ranking each of the arcs within the saga against each other. And in first place, we have the Romance Dawn arc at 86.67%, Arlong Park arc second, 76.67%, Orange Town arc at 76%, in third, fourth Baretti arc, 68.33%, Syrup Village at 64%, and the Buggy Side Story arc, regrettably, at 55%. Logtown arc so far has a score of 19 out of 60. Wow. And then to do that all again on the personal side, Buggy Side arc obviously is in first place at 90%. Arlong Park arc second at 76%, followed by Orangetown arc, which was 74%, Romance Dawn arc 66.67%, Baretti arc 52.5%, Syrup Village arc down at 49%, and then the Logtown arc so far has a score of 14 out of a possible 60. Leading us into our final segment, which is the series ranking so far. This is where we're ranking each of the sagas against each other. So far, East Blue Saga's completed sagas have given it a score, or completed arcs have given it a score of 34 out of a possible 80. And then on the personal ranking side, the East Blue Sagas got a score of 30 out of 80. But with that, we've now rewatched and ranked One Piece East Blue Saga Logtown Arc, Episode 49. Sendai Katetsu and Yabashiri, Zoro's new swords, and the female sergeant major. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.